he shot and killed the German priest who had been listening to his confession. Elegantly, he ejected the spent shell from his rifle, then walked out of the church without looking back. His name was Gred, holding a shiny Winchester in his hands, with intricate gear spurs on his boots. It was not hard to tell he was a typical Texan cowboy, but he had traveled all the way to a remote valley in Germany under the guise of a photographer, supposedly for some field work. The reason he had come was because of the valley's absurd customs, which was exactly what had brought him across the Atlantic. At first, the people in the valley didn't welcome him, but after receiving a bag of gold coins he threw at them, their leader reluctantly agreed to take Gred to the home of a farmer woman. For a single gold coin, they would care for this stranger for the entire winter. Though the farmer woman looked unwilling, nearly every decision in the valley was controlled by these people, as they were the 6 sons of the landowner, Brenner, and the only ones allowed to carry firearms. They also summoned the farmer's daughter, Lucy, pulling her by the neck to make her greet Gred. While their outward behavior was rude and domineering, their true cruelty went much further. At dinner that night, Lucy showed an unusual interest in Gred, constantly asking him about things from across the Atlantic. However, she wasn't interested in Gred because of any romantic attraction. She already had a lover in the valley. What she truly longed for was to escape from the gloomy valley. From that point on, Gred would roam the valley, taking photos with his camera, and occasionally helping the mother and daughter with heavy chores, giving the impression of an artist visiting from afar. One day, he went out with Lucy to the village store to buy supplies. After purchasing some iron nails for a ladder, the landowner's sons, who had been drinking behind him, began to cause trouble. They spoke to Lucy with a tone that made it seem as if she belonged to them. Gred couldn't stand it and stepped in to defend Lucy, which angered them. However, being the largest landowner in the valley, he knew he couldn't act too recklessly. Instead, he had the shopkeeper pour 2 cups of wine and insisted that Gred drink with him. Gred, showing no respect, refused, stating he didn't drink. The man, embarrassed, put the cup down and suddenly knocked him out with a punch. In the midst of his brother's gloating laughs, the man grabbed a bottle and poured alcohol into Gred's mouth, forcing him to drink. It wasn't until Lucy intervened that they stopped, laughing and walking away. Afterward, Lucy advised Gred to leave the valley quickly, as it wasn't a safe place. She suggested he should leave before the snow sealed the mountain roads, but Gred paid her no mind, thinking it would be better if they were trapped here too, as it would prevent them from escaping. Soon, a heavy snowstorm covered the entire valley, and the people began working frantically. They needed to chop down trees from the mountain and use the snow to reduce friction as they transported them downhill. In the dense fog, one group worked on the mountain, placing logs, while another group waited at the bottom to collect the logs from the slide. During their hard work, a log seemed to get stuck in the middle. The landowner's son, who had mocked Gred earlier, volunteered to investigate, but no sound came from him for a long time. In the anxious waiting of his older brother, Hans, a log finally slid down. The brother who had gone to investigate had already been killed. That night, the landowner, Brenner, was deeply saddened, but he couldn't see any signs of foul play and assumed it was an accident. Not far away, Gred watched the scene from his horse. Only Lucy seemed to sense that there was something more to the situation, suspecting that Gred was somehow involved. However, she had no time to consider this, as her wedding was fast approaching. Despite a death in the village, the priest still tried to hurry and perform the wedding ceremony at the landowner's request. Looking at the groom's family arriving for the wedding, Lucy appeared quite distressed. She deeply loved her lover, but the marriage also brought with it an unspeakable reality. Upstairs, Gred watched everything unfold, realizing that he had to act again. Then, when another of the landowner's sons went hunting in the snow, the prey he had been about to catch was suddenly startled by another noise in the forest and ran away. Furious, he yelled for the intruder to come out, but instead of finding another hunter, he walked straight into a carefully set trap. A branch full of iron nails struck him in the face. Blinded, he panicked and fell off a cliff. His prolonged absence soon caught the landowner's attention, prompting the remaining 4 sons to go search for him. Gred had clearly anticipated this. He had Lucy pack some provisions for him and then retrieved his Winchester hidden inside a canvas, loading bullets and donning his signature cowboy boots. Under the watchful eyes of the mother and daughter, he left the house. By the time the old landowner had removed the nails from his son's body and realized he had been murdered, the 4 remaining sons were already out looking for Gred. But despite another death in the village, the wedding preparations for Lucy's marriage still continued. On the day of the wedding, the newlyweds wore grim faces. The priest told a story from the Bible about Joseph, who, upon learning that his fiancée was pregnant, still accepted her and cared for her as she gave birth to Jesus. It seemed that the priest was trying to convey that accepting an imperfect wife was a noble act. After the guests left, Gred entered the church and told the priest that he had come to confess his sins of murder. When the priest asked who he had killed, Gred took out a photo from his pocket watch, which made the priest recall a story from many years ago. It was about a couple who had fled to this valley seeking help from the landowner, Brenner. But Brenner had only been interested in looking at their young daughter, and then he made them an offer. Though the couple found it absurd, they were starving and desperate, so they reluctantly agreed. Before long, their daughter reached marriageable age, and it was time for Brenner to fulfill his promise. That was the night when the landlord Brenner demanded his first night right over her, ensuring that she conceived before being allowed to reunite with her groom. After he had his way, the groom finally gathered enough courage to sneak away with his beloved. The couple hid in the shopkeeper's basement, believing that paying the money would grant them a place to stay for the night. However, Brenner had offered more money, and the greedy female shopkeeper betrayed them. The newlyweds were brutally punished. They nailed the groom to a cross, intending to kill him in front of the bride. Heartbroken, the bride grabbed the reins and broke free from her bonds, escaping the hellish place and fleeing across the Atlantic. Her family was burned alive along with their house, and her lover was nailed to the cross until his bones turned to dust. And Gred was the son she bore after arriving in America. His return here was for the sole purpose of avenging those who had committed such atrocities to his mother. What Gred had not expected was that the priest, who had nailed the groom to the cross all those years ago, was still aiding in the cruelty. At that moment, no further words were needed. He donned his hat, not intending to give the priest a chance for a deathbed confession. He stepped out, opened the confession booth door, and with one pull of the trigger, shot the fake priest dead. Afterward, he left the church without a backward glance. Meanwhile, at the wedding feast, Brenner's sons were gleefully watching the guests eat. In contrast to their ease and merriment, the other guests looked solemn, no hint of celebration on their faces. Hans, Brenner's eldest son, signaled to the band to begin playing music. Then, he walked up to the newlyweds and motioned for them to stand and dance. The bride and groom, unsure of his intentions, hesitated, exchanging glances with their relatives, but under his domineering gaze, they reluctantly stood and began to dance. After only a short while, the man who had previously forced Gred to drink grabbed the bride and dragged her away to dance with him. The villagers' faces were numb with indifference, their silence more chilling than anything else. Clearly, as Brenner grew older, the first night rites had passed on to his sons. At this moment, two of the brothers were already fighting for dominance over the bride during the dance. Unable to watch any longer, the groom attempted to intervene, but was struck down by a slap, then beaten mercilessly. Only the bride dared to speak out against it, while the men shouted at her, revealing their foolishness and the absurd rights they inherited from their father. The most disturbing thing was that most of the villagers saw nothing wrong with it. Once the chaos had subsided, Hans, the eldest son, signaled for his brothers to stop. Then, they dragged the bride home, leaving behind a silent, abandoned wedding hall. However, on their way back, they encountered Gred, who had been waiting. He raised his rifle and ordered them to release Lucy. Hans, the leader, sneered. The men at the back raised their guns in response, but Hans, locked in Gred's unblinking stare, was too frightened to act. Gred instructed Lucy to grab his rifle, then made each of the men throw their weapons down and dismount. He removed the saddles from the horses, letting them go. To prevent a chase, he ordered Lucy to ride ahead, while he held his rifle to ensure none of the men dared move. Despite Hans' threats, Gred remained unfazed, promising to settle the score the following morning at their house. He then mounted his horse and followed Lucy. At this point, the brothers had no idea what they were up against. If they had fought earlier, armed only with a Mauser bolt-action rifle and 3 side-by-side shotguns, they might have managed to put up a fight. But they were up against Gred's lever-action Winchester, a weapon that would cost them dearly in the near future. That night, Gred safely escorted Lucy back to her family, where the groom was overjoyed, but the father, looking at the confiscated rifle, looked grave, and his mother scolded him for not allowing Lucy to spend the night with the man. Faced with such numb people, Gred could only bear the burden alone. As he was about to leave, an old woman seemed to recognize him. She grabbed Gred and stared at him for a while, then thanked him. Perhaps it was her old age, or perhaps a sense of regret for never having fought against the injustices in her past, that made her thank him. Meanwhile, Brenner's remaining sons were preparing their weapons. Their isolated life had left them a little out of touch with the times, but they were determined to find Gred before he came to them. Brenner, their father, arrogantly commanded his sons to capture Gred alive. But Gred, having anticipated this, first intended to settle an old score. He arrived at the shopkeeper's house. The old woman, thinking he had come to rob them, was surprised when Gred threw a sack of gold coins at her. With a cruel glare, he told her to swallow the coins. After all, she loved money, so now she could eat her fill. The old man, watching his wife dry heave, begged for mercy. But Gred, filled with rage, turned and shot him, knocking the man unconscious. Then, with a look of disgust, he grabbed the coins and shoved them into the woman's mouth, intending to choke her with her greed. But seeing her pain, he relented, pulled his hand away, and left the house. He didn't kill the couple. Perhaps leaving them with guilt for the rest of their days was punishment enough. Or perhaps it was his kindness. Knowing that the true villain was Brenner, he returned to the small cabin where he had been hiding and slept through the night. But at the crack of dawn, Brenner's sons had already surrounded the place. The sounds of the horses outside roused Gred from his sleep. In a panic, he grabbed his rifle and peered out. The enemy was already only a few meters away. There was no cover, and the flimsy wooden cabin offered no protection. Though the brothers had never seen much of the world, their hunting skills and basic combat training made them formidable. Following the eldest brother's signal, they fired their rifles at the cabin. The gunshots echoed, alarming the villagers from afar, but no one knew what to do. After reloading, the brothers fired again. The small cabin was so tiny that even a bear wouldn't survive inside, so they sent one man inside to check. He pushed open the door, scanning the room, but saw no sign of any bodies. A figure emerged from beneath the floor, and a single shot pierced his neck. It wasn't until the men outside saw their brother staggering out of the house, blood pouring from his wound, that they reacted. They shouted, scrambling to find cover, when Gred kicked aside a floorboard, fired again, and shot the most arrogant man in the leg. The other two brothers quickly turned to shoot, but their two shotguns only had 4 shells left, leaving Gred no trouble as he moved from under the floor to outside the house, continuing his fire on them. The first brother who was shot had still been able to breathe, but after his brother reloaded his gun and took a blind shot, he was hit again and died. The oldest brother, realizing the situation, was frustrated as the man on the ground continued to scream, driving them crazy. The second brother ran to the other side after the oldest brother covered him with a shot, hoping to split Gred's aim. As long as Gred focused on one side, they could strike back from the other. Gred heard the movement and realized what they were trying to do. He took a deep breath, deciding to take a risk and force one of them out. While the oldest brother was reloading, he stood up and shot the man on the ground who was still groaning in pain, which caused the second brother to snap. Hearing that the second brother was also hit, the oldest brother froze. He quickly reloaded and tried to rush over to save his brother, but when he aimed his gun at Gred, he was shot back. However, the brother he was trying to save was already lying silently on the ground, and the man who screamed the loudest had been ignored. The two brothers struggled to reload their guns under Gred's blind spot. Besides being annoyed by the man's desperate screams, Gred stayed relatively calm, cursing under his breath while preparing combat plans for the second brother, but they were out of their depth, making fatal mistakes. Gred had already fired 2 shots, while Hans, the oldest, had only fired 1 shot and still had 1 shell left, which made him feel confident, so he finally relaxed. Watching Gred stand up, Hans even managed to smile, but the brother who had fallen to the ground had already collapsed in despair, and he didn't hear Gred stop to reload. The shining barrel was already aimed at his forehead. Without a word, Gred pulled the trigger and finished the fight. As he stood up and walked away, the man on the ground was still gasping but had no strength to scream anymore. Gred didn't bother with him and went straight to their house to kill the landlord, Brenner. When Brenner saw him enter the room, he already knew the fate of his sons, but he couldn't understand why Gred was there to kill their whole family. It wasn't until Gred threw his pocket watch on the ground and showed him the photo inside that Brenner realized the man before him was also his son. Gred couldn't hold back tears as this evil, elderly man approached him. His long-lost biological father had caused his mother to suffer, and now Gred had crossed the Atlantic to kill 6 half-brothers, and had to personally kill his own father. But he didn't hesitate, because his mission was not just revenge, it was to end this ridiculous and sinful legacy. Finally, with Lucy and her husband watching, Gred left the place. It seemed like he took with him the darkness that once made Lucy lose hope in that valley. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.